Hello and welcome to a video with Perspectiva. I'm Jonathan Rowson, Director of Perspectiva, and we are a community in London, a community of expert generalists, we sometimes call ourselves. And we're interested in the relationship between systems, souls, and society in theory and practice. What does that mean? Well, it means that when we look at political events and economic developments and pandemics and climate change and inequality and all of the issues of the day, we try to see them in their broadest, fullest, and deepest perspective, particularly with some concern for the inner world. And this series of interviews that will take place try to sort of do that. They try to hold the whole position as far as possible, particularly with regard to the interiority, so the inside of the experience, what it's like to actually look at the world as a whole from the inside as far as possible. And that's a big ambition, of course, but that's what we try and do here. I'm joined by a colleague and friend, Mark Vernon. Mark is currently a psychotherapist, but wasn't always thus. He has been an Anglican priest. He has been a scientist of sorts. He has also been a philosopher and has written a great deal about reality writ large and ethics and friendship and a range of other things. Lots of popular books out there. His most recent book, and I'll just do the plug because as an author, we all love our plugs, but Mark's most recent book is called A Secret History of Christianity. And it's a wonderful book. And the title's actually not exactly misleading, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It's in some ways a story of the evolution of consciousness in which the story of Jesus plays a starring role, but it's very much deeper and broader than that. Right, so that's the introduction.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, somewhat formal out of the way. But I mean, I also know Mark personally, so I can say more sort of candidly off the cuff that he's known in amongst our circle of friends as the wisest among us, as it were, and often he is sought out for his advice and insight into a range of things. So I've asked him to join us today because he's just written a rather extraordinary essay. And you can find this online, but for what it's worth, here it is. And the essay is called The Fourfold Imagination. William Blake saw angels and ghosts and the hallelujah sunrise, even on the darkest day. We need to foster his state of mind. That's what the subheading says. So first thing I want to ask you, Mark, is give me a little bit of context about who William Blake was, because mostly I want to speak about the imagination, but give us a little bit of context about Blake for those who are not so familiar or need refreshing. And then talk me through the essay, and then we'll try and dig into it in a bit more depth.
Yeah, well, thank you. So he was a figure not pivotal in his time, but has become better and better known since. He died at the beginning of the 19th century. He was just a little bit before what we now think of as the Romantic movement. So he didn't meet Coleridge, but was a little bit older than Coleridge and Wordsworth. He lived in London nearly all his life. He's a very seminal figure, even in South London where I live, and it's partly why I feel drawn to him, because I feel like if he can see angels on Peckham Rye, then maybe there's all sorts of things that I might be able to see around and about as well. But he's become hugely popular. I mean, in the essay I mentioned how a couple of years back, a new stone was laid over the site of his grave in Bunhill Fields in North London, and just the word of mouth went out that was going to be a sort of informal unveiling, and hundreds of people showed up, and it was even slightly starry. Right. Figures like Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden showed up, right. So he speaks to a lot of people, but in quite a diverse set of ways. And I felt that there's something particularly about his real bet that he places on the human imagination, the trust that he gives to that faculty. He believes it is nothing less than the truth-bearing capacity we have, and wanted to try and really nail it for myself, right, in the first instance, but then try and communicate it so it might make sense to others as well, and so hence the essay.
Great. And the essay includes, everyone loves a list, as they say, right? And it's not exactly a list, but it does say fourfold imagination. And I think that's intriguing from the outset, because we hear quite a lot about the imagination, and Einstein's quotation that imagination is more important than knowledge is wheeled out on self-help books and management books around the world, often as a kind of invocation that one must imagine. But there are real constraints on the imagination. It's not trivial just to imagine other things. We have to imagine with something, through something, for something. And you speak in quite some depth about different ways of doing that, and how imagination evolves, develops, moves in some sense. So tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the first move is to, in a funny sort of way, demythologize the imagination, and to say that we're using it always, all the time anyway.
Right.
You may think you're the most unimaginative person possible, but you still speak. And words are themselves an imaginative part of what it is to be human. You hear a sound on the airwaves and don't just feel it makes some sense, but it starts communicating a whole world to you, or at least a thought in that moment.
Right.
So Blake's point really is that we use the imagination all the time. And so the question is not, am I imaginative? The question is, how am I using that imagination, and can it be developed?
Right.
And so I think his poetry and his images can be enjoyed, struggled with, kind of contested, all the rest of it, as almost like an exercise in developing your imagination. So in the essay, I try to give a sort of a starter for 10 with this by thinking about how he looked at the sun, because this is famous. Well, it wasn't a story as in something that happened, but he had a kind of discussion with himself where he gets an imaginative figure to ask him,
right.
When you see the sunrise, do you see a guinea coming up over the horizon, a small golden coin, as it were? And Blake says, no, I see the angelic host crying, holy, holy, holy. And you think, was this guy on some kind of trip? Did he just have a very vivid but slightly out of control imagination? And I think his point is that whatever you see when you see the sun rising, you're using your imagination. If you see a guinea, a golden disc, you've already described it as the golden disc looking a bit like a guinea in the sky. Right. Even if you just see a burning ball of fire that is packing the energy out because of the processes of fusion, you've already, you're deploying quite a lot of scientific imagination there to describe it.
Right.
And so his point is, by trusting the imagination, by seeing how it can be developed, you can actually move from looking at the sun in one way to looking at it another. And it's not, as it were, a natural look just to see it as a burning ball of fire in the sky. That already is deploying this scientific imagination.
Right.
So that means you can look at the sun by bringing other kinds of imagination to bear on the image that otherwise just sort of strikes your eye. It never just strikes your eye neat, as it were. It's always already interpreted.
But this is where
the mind is what sees rather than the eyes, as he put it.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll come to that when we're describing in a bit more depth the four main stages that you outline. But I want to just begin by being clear what we really mean by imagination. I mean, the analytic philosopher inside me is a little bit uncomfortable. He wants to know, how you distinguish it from perception, how you distinguish it from metaphor. Is it always creative insight? Is it merely, is it something about conjuring of things that are not already there? So there's lots of sort of overlapping, concepts around imagination that bleed into it in certain ways. And I'm just wondering how much distinct conceptual space does imagination have, and how would you characterize that?
Well, it's a big concept rather than just part of, say, perception. I mean, I think Blake would say that all perception involves imagination in some way or other, or to use William James's phrase, all we get is a sort of blooming confusion of apperception. So we're always using the imagination. That's not to say that the imagination always is straightforward, and maybe very rarely is it straightforward. A distinction that, at least as a starter, was the one that Coleridge made, that Blake brought into, that there's a difference between, in Coleridge's terms, fantasy and imagination. Right. So fantasy just means kind of playing with images. They may be amusing, they may be destructive, but they don't really go anywhere. They kind of get you for a moment and then just sort of pass away, and don't really develop very far.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas imagination proper for Coleridge and for Blake is that perception which has a kind of inner momentum. It can be developed. It carries you in a new direction. And I think that, you know, when Einstein makes his remark about imagination circling the world, that's what he means. Einstein actually himself, as Walter Isaacson puts it in his biography of Einstein, believed that the imagination wasn't just a kind of byproduct of some evolutionary process that is amusing and adds a bit of color to life, but doesn't really mean much more than that. Now, Einstein was very clear that the imagination is what takes us into reality, and we can trust it. And that's what he did when he rode on the light beam that then led to the maths that kind of dropped out of the imaginative activity that led to special relativity. So it's something, it's that kind of big sense of the imagination. Definitely needs discerning.
But it's not, okay, no, I'm just trying to get a little bit, I mean, I realize we could spend all day and more and not actually nail it, as it were. And maybe it's the kind of thing that shouldn't be nailed, you know, like a butterfly shouldn't be nailed to understand what it is. But I still want to get somewhat clearer, because the way you're describing it there sounds like consciousness as such. And I'm reminded of famous, you know, songs like, you know, John Lennon's Imagine, for example, or, you know, the popular culture notion of imagination being gazing out a train window and thinking of how things might be different. Or use your imagination would be come up with a creative solution. So I'm just trying to tease apart the somewhat more technical sense of imagination, however expansive it is, from the more vernacular, however imprecise it is. Because if we are going to place faith in the imagination, and the reason I'm asking this now, and the reason I think it's worthwhile to spend time on it, is that I do feel there's something like a crisis of imagination. I think it's really hard to imagine different kinds of world. I think many sociologists, I think originally Zygmunt Bauman, but many others since, have said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And so when we come to that kind of constraint on the imagination, that we're somehow using what we're familiar with, tables, chairs, you know, other medium-sized objects, cultural associations of the stars and the sky, we're using those things to try to imagine. And yet, if there is a richer texture of imagination, if imagination has more than we realize, and Blake sort of points towards that in some way, it would be really good to understand what is distinctive in that conception of imagination. So I understand it's expansive, but can you help me understand why it's not merely consciousness and why it's not merely perception?
I mean, I think it is pretty close to perception, actually. There's quite a lot of overlap there, but it is more in the domain of, say, self-consciousness. It has a more active sense than just mere consciousness.
Right. So it's sort of perception with, how would you put it? Perception with impetus.
With, maybe like with design, or with interpretation.
Or intentionality, something.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's very close to the Kantian idea that we perceive the world through kind of inherent mental structures, like space, like time. Yeah. And the difference would be that in the Romantic reading of Kant, this does actually put us in touch with the thing in itself, which Kant thought didn't happen because he saw these things as just sort of in the mind.
Right.
But the Romantics do push it further back than that. It can also help, actually, you know, just to think about the evolution of consciousness idea, because that, one way of putting that is that different peoples collectively, not just individually, have had different imaginative takes on the world. And they clearly have differed very substantially. And the experience of being alive differs very substantially. Now, you know,
so that's that much I understand, because and we come to that actually because you've written about that beautifully in your book, and it's also the work of, you know, Gebser, for example, and Sri Aurobindo and various others have spoken about this evolution of consciousness. I suppose I'm just trying to, I don't want to wordplay too much, but just that when we're talking about imagination, we're speaking about something about, it's related closely to perception, but it's perception that includes some sense of interiority, maybe, and it's got an active level. So it's not just something that comes to us, but something we actually relate to or generate in some way. And I think it's just important to sort of know where we are with that. When we
Mhm.
say imagination as a fourfold aspect, we're saying there's something about the nature of the active and inner nature of human perception that has its own reality and its own generativity and its own evolution in a way.
Yeah, no, it's really worth pressing at this. I mean, I wonder if a couple of other examples might help to illuminate it a bit. I mean, I work as a psychotherapist, and one way of thinking about psychotherapy would be it is the effort to expand someone's imaginative engagement with their state of mind. You know, depression or anxiety could be described as being too trapped or locked in one sense of the world,
Right.
and that through the process of psychotherapy you try and gain other senses of the world, and that is about trying to actively, intentionally feel into what's happening,
Right.
so that something else might show itself.
So
But it is reflexive too. And maybe that's another way in which imagination might be illuminated. You know, the artist, for example, that deliberately uses their imagination to try and create something. There's several perhaps elements at work there. There's their training, their skill, the hours they put in. There's their materials, you know, whether it be paint, whether it be words. That too gives them something. They have to work with that. And there's their experience. They have to work with that. And the imagination, you might say, is the thing that can bring all those elements together to create something that then speaks, first of all, to the artist, but then to other people as well. Yeah, so it's an integrating function as well.
So yeah, I can see that. So integrating function is good. That's helpful. And maybe even, what's the relationship, would you say, between imagination and change or inertia? That it seems to be something about imagination that's inherently, you know, maybe transformative or generative or active. That what makes it imagination and not merely perception or memory is that somehow it's pioneering, somehow it's venturing into something new. Is that right? I mean, is that?
Yeah, that is right. I mean, that's why, you know, the scientists would say you need imagination as well as good ability at maths and reading the evidence and so on. I mean, I think it can work also very actively to try and keep things the same. You know, in some ways, the person that's suffering from depression or anxiety and experiencing the world almost just in one way is actually working really hard so they only perceive the world in one way. Or a culture that gets very locked in terms of its cultural life. It's probably very heavily working imaginatively to keep things looking grey, to keep things looking mechanical, to keep, you know, one worldview in place, and to block out other possibilities. That too is a kind of inverse imaginative act. I mean, that's what Newton called what Blake called Newton's sleep.
Newton's sleep, yeah.
Whether or not he was fair on Newton is another point, but that for him is the single vision. And it's still an imagine, as opposed to fourfold. It's the single vision that's still the use of the imagination, but to try and close things down, which takes quite a lot of effort too.
Great. Well, that's a good segue actually, because I wanted, now you can tell me about these four I don't know how you describe them, as stages or elements or phases or however you'd phrase it, but you've got Ulro, generation, Beulah, and eternity. So tell me, you were just beginning to describe Ulro there, so tell me more about that.
Yeah, so the names that Blake gives them are these like single vision, twofold, threefold, fourfold. And he gave them names because he realized that they have a kind of inner dynamism of their own. And again, that makes him a romantic figure. He's not just talking about what goes on inside our head, but it's as much how what goes on inside our head engages with the vitalities around and about. And different stages will conceive of those vitalities in different ways.
So if I can just pause philosophically there, if you don't mind, just when Blake's using this terminology, he's not necessarily using it in the same way that a developmental psychologist would describe a stage of development, like a socialized mind or a self-authoring mind or post-conventional or conventional in Kohlberg's terms. He seems to be saying that these are actually forces in the world in some sense, which we, I don't know, inhabit in some way or relate to in some ways. Is that closer to it?
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, a lot of people can say share the Ulro state of mind,
Right.
which it suggests that it exists at least in their shared minds,
Right.
if not in some way has some existence of its own, which the minds then discover.
Right.
I mean, personally, I'm quite open to that, because I think that consciousness is not something the brain generates. It's something the brain tunes into, along with everything else that we are, as well as our time and place and so on. But I appreciate that is quite a leap. But nonetheless, it's quite clear that we do share experiences of the world. So at least these conscious states are shared across many people, if not whole times and places.
Right.
So, you know, it makes sense to name them in that way.
But for one's imagination to be an Ulro, you are single pointed. I think you use the example of data here in the essay. And it's interesting vis-a-vis the time we're living in, COVID, and you say that the idea of trying to flatten the curve would even be an example of Ulro. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, so Ulro can be summarized as the state of mind where really only quantities exist. They're thought to be the real things. You know, it might be the atom that you supposedly can almost pick up. I mean, physics doesn't actually think of atoms like that at all, but nonetheless, there's a kind of popular perception that that might be so, an imaginative perception that might be so. And then, you know, quantities, statistics, generalizations, you know, laws of nature would be part of what Ulro loves. Mm-hmm. And for Blake, there's always kind of two sides. There's one side of Ulro, which when Ulro just thinks it alone is the truth, right. And that is a constraining state of mind.
I mean, you know, arguably that's the rationalist community, or, you know, there's lots of people, I can think of lots of people who sound like they think like that.
Yeah, yeah. You know, the people that might use a lot of mechanical imagery when they describe the world. You know, you sense that they kind of trust the Ulro state of mind more than any other.
Right.
You know, they'll talk about feeling good because it's a rush of serotonin or something.
Right. Just to be clear, Mark, because this is quite important for grasping Blake's contemporary relevance. We're not talking about something that happened back in, you know, 1780 or something, and or 1850, or that somehow there was a state of mind that we've now moved beyond. It's very much a live, current state of mind. It might even, in some contexts, be the dominant one in certain, you know, people who've worked in civil service or government often describe the famous paper from Jake Chapman at Demos. He wrote about, you know, systems. I think he called it systems. I forget the title now, but systems change was the idea. But what he was describing was the pervasive use of mechanical metaphors in government and the inability to think outside of them. And so a policy was always delivered, for example, and it was like turning the wheels of government was the expression used, and moving this up a gear, and this sort of thing was absolutely endemic. And so Ulro is not to be thought of as some kind of archaic notion. It's actually living with us, and in some ways, its weaknesses are part of what we're struggling to move out of or move beyond.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think Blake is a modern thinker, artist, you know, so he was definitely reflecting on the times which are still ours. He lived perhaps at the, you know, closer to the origins of the modern world, where the scientific worldview that could deliver the kind of technologies which would change and powerfully shape the world. His famous phrase, dark satanic mills, captures some of that. He had, you know, in a way, he lives at the origins of it, so he has a kind of freshness to it. And I think that's why, even 300 years on, we kind of can return to it and feel the sort of fresh bite of what he was trying to communicate now.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's definitely, I mean, I think he speaks more in a way widely to our times now than perhaps he even did to people in his own times.
Right.
For whom Ulro was delivering amazing things, sort of almost unquestionably good.
Right, but I mean, that may be the case 300 years ago, but I sense it quite a lot today. I mean, you know, there's a lot of people working on machine learning using expressions like the algorithmic society. And you can see even in the contemporary UK government, quite a strong desire to, you know, capture huge amounts of data and analyze it in such a way that that itself will somehow deliver what you want. And again, look, deliver what you want, you know. So this is serious business in a sense. You know, the Ulro state of mind, the Ulro imagination being pervasive and endemic is just worth sitting with. Because I think often when we describe these maps, we tend to think, well, those are the things in the past. Let's get interesting in the final stage. Let's talk about that, because that's where we want to get to. But actually, these are all coexisting, relating to each other. And okay, so that's Ulro. And then you move on.
Maybe just add there that a couple of thoughts. One is that, I mean, on the artificial intelligence side, I think one of the changes which has come about in the last 5 or 10 years or so is the realization that algorithms aren't going to mirror our intelligence,
right.
but they might be they might become an intelligence of their own.
Yes.
And that is, Blake would say, that's because you're discovering how Ulro can be a whole worldview in itself. And it can look, when you're right in the middle of it, completely consistent and so on.
Yes.
So that's, he would understand that.
And am I right in thinking, I mean, this is a whole other body of research, but this would be something like what Ian McGilchrist describes as the limitations of the left hemisphere as well.
Yeah, because one of the things, you know, Ian in his book writes a lot about Blake. Right. He's quite a go-to person because one of the things which Blake realized is that to move to different levels of consciousness, you have to be able to tolerate what seem like contradictions or contraries, was Blake's phrase. And it's in that tension, that paradox, that something new begins to emerge. So this really suits the idea that the right and the left hemisphere in some kind of tension, and that when the left can open up to the right enough, that makes for some sort of moment of transformation. But when it gets shut down, that's when you get stuck.
Yes, and stuck we are perhaps, but yeah. Okay, generation, because it's a nice sounding word, and I often use the term generative. I'm told I use that too often. But generation is the second of these 4 phases, and that's, you said, twofold vision. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, so generation knows that there's something called the life force, if you like. It knows that there are kind of vitalities beyond just sheer quantities that somehow could be pushed and pulled around like a machine. Mm-hmm. Blake means generation in a slightly derogatory sense. You know, all these words can mean different things at different times, but he really means it meaning kind of reproduction.
Right.
And it might easily...
It's almost satire. I mean, it's almost, there's irony there, I think, if I'm not mistaken, because having read your essay and the emphasis on repetition, if he's calling it generation, it's almost as if there's a little bit of a, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I can hear a sort of irony in there as well.
Yeah, no. He often talks about it as the vegetative state as well, which, and his image there is like a kind of ivy that just would crawl over and reproduce so as to cover everything, you know.
But without any apparent purpose.
It's definitely a kind of powerful force, but it's a bit purposeless. It's a bit without meaning. And, you know, left to its own devices is a bit smothering and overwhelming. Right. That's sort of the sense of generation.
So that's interesting, because when I thought of Ulro, I thought of machine intelligence and the algorithmic society. And when I thought of generation, what came to mind there was, you know, indefinite economic growth. This sort of sense of this premise that this thing has to just keep going and keep going. And it's not, no one's there. Well, it's not true anymore. There's quite a big counterculture now saying, why are we growing? What does this growth even mean? You know, is it coherent? Is it a value? Does it lead to a good life for everyone? But the policymakers that be still measure their success to a large extent on this growth metric of GDP particularly. And it does feel like that kind of mentality of more of this, without asking what this is or what it's for.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, in the essay I say, sometimes when I walk into supermarkets and just see endless branded cereal or toothpaste or whatever, that's a kind of feels like a little generative consciousness in Blake's terms.
Right.
Is there any real need for that? Well, no, apart from brand extension.
Yeah.
But what your comment also illustrates is how these different states of mind do relate, because what that's about, when growth is perceived as a good in itself, that then is measured by metrics like GDP, that's Ulro in the service of generation.
Right.
So and there is a dynamic that it's not that Blake thinks we don't need, as it were, single vision, twofold vision. The question is, what are they in the service of?
Yes.
And when they're in the service of themselves, it's when they tend to get locked and stuck.
Right.
But if they can be in the service of, for want of a better expression, a sort of higher or more complex consciousness, then they can be really good.
Right.
They can be, you know, in the service of our humanity.
Yes.
You really need, I think, to get to fourfold vision for it to be fully in the service of humanity. We'll
Yeah.
come to that.
Sure.
But nonetheless, you know, growth as somehow a good is generation harnessing Ulro, but it still is this question of, you know, but what is this good?
Yeah.
So hence people ask the questions, why do we trust GDP so much?
Yeah. But also, you mentioned consumption in particular, and this indefinite consumption. It's almost like, you know, people sense the purpose of life is not to consume, but it's quite difficult to escape it. And just as it's hard to imagine a world beyond capitalism, likewise consumerism, which is a kind of handmaiden of capitalism in a way. And it's like, you know, it meets certain emotional needs. It's not a completely useless system. I mean, having desires and you know, having a way of getting income to buy things to satisfy those desires and ad infinitum is, you know, it's lacking a certain soul and beauty, but it has a certain functionality. So it's not as though it's stupid. It's just maybe limited in some way. There's more to say about generation than that it's repetition writ large. For example, I was thinking when I was reading about it that I'm reminded of Robert Colasso writing about ritual as repetition, and that to understand ritual, you need to understand the value of repetition. So I'm wondering if there might be something in that vis-a-vis generation's value.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to have life, you need generation. That's no coincidence that the words are connected. But again, the question is, what is that generation about? So similarly, a ritual could become a dead, empty ritual if it's just merely repeated.
Right.
But when it's enacted with a higher consciousness, it becomes meaningful and pregnant and endlessly revelatory.
Right.
So again, that would be the sort of sense of how generation itself, like Ulro, needs to be in the service of something else.
Which brings us to Beulah, right? You call it, which is the most of all the terms, maybe Ulro is a bit exotic too, but Beulah, where did that word come from even? I mean, why use that?
Well, it comes from the Hebrew Bible. You know, Blake learned to read by reading the Bible, and it comes from the prophets who prophesied that my land will be called Beulah, and it means blessed, and it conjures up the sense of the land of milk and honey. You know, pleasant. There's love. There's meaning. There's a sense that life has purpose. I-it relationships in the earlier consciousnesses become I-thou relationships, to use Martin Buber's expression. So it's like another aspect of reality, interiority, soul. You know, someone in Beulah doesn't have to go around saying, but is there really a soul? They kind of feel it.
Right.
And so it's a word that captures a lived experience. So Beulah is very much you know, a sort of expanded experience of life. It's not just generation for its own sake now, it's generation in the service of growing love, sharing interests, developing kind of higher concerns. Right.
So it's value rich. You know, it sounds like Beulah is a world where people can distinguish different kinds of value. And even virtue. I mean, I'm guessing the idea of growing and developing, and, you know, the notion of spiritual growth, for example, would make sense in Beulah.
It would to a degree, but I think actually it's in Blake's terms, it's more, rather than virtue, which are kind of qualities of our character or our personality, it's more interested in ethics or morality, which are principles that try to safeguard certain values. So Beulah certainly recognizes values and principles in it, and in particular recognizes values and principles that secure interpersonal relationships, that value other human beings, because love in a way is the big value in Beulah. But there's a kind of twist, because when you try and govern relationships by principles, there's always the risk that the principles attack the human beings that seem to fall short of the values. And you see that, you know, ethics can be weaponized. And, you know, in the culture wars today, at their best, probably all sides of culture wars are trying to secure certain values.
Yeah.
It's just that there's huge conflict about that, and so the opposite side demonizes the other.
Right.
And that is very much the dark side, the shadow side of Beulah.
Okay, that's
Blake called it the wastes of the moral law.
Wow.
The moral law can actually lay waste to what was otherwise a Beulah land, commodious and beautiful.
So what was blessed is then somehow destroyed. Okay, so that's really intriguing, because it sounds as though, based on what you said about generations serving Ulro, there's something about Ulro serving generation. There's something about generation serving Beulah as well, because somehow all of this growth, it's often presented in in a more sociological sense as, people have their private realms. They raise their children, they have their projects, they have their careers. And we need somehow a prosperous society so that people can have their private lives. And the real value is in the private life. But you need the kind of prosperity and the peace for those private lives to actually function. But what I really thought about vis-a-vis Beulah, to be honest, is, as you know, I did some work for the Open Society Foundations as a fellow on human rights and some of the limitations of human rights. Not that we don't want human rights, of course, but just that an overemphasis on rights can actually undermine the broader cause of sort of dignity, equality, and capability that lies at the heart of the case for rights. And I thought a lot about human rights in the context of Beulah. So for me, I saw Ulro as machine learning or algorithmic society, generation as a problem of consumerism and capitalism writ large, particularly indefinite economic growth. And then I saw in Beulah the issue of an over-reliance on a formalized, bureaucratic and overly explicit moral framework that actually becomes legal, form of underpins the rule of law, but unknowingly or unwittingly often subverts the sort of stream of virtue and real goodness that you need for those things to actually function. That's how I saw it. I don't know how that sounds.
Yeah.
That's how I saw it.
Yeah, no, that really does make sense. I mean, I think that does characterize these qualities, these different qualities of existence very well. I mean, it's quite, you see it in everyday relationships. A couple will fall in love and they'll make commitments to each other, covenant themselves to each other, which is an expression of the love. It's in the service of the love. But then things go wrong, and before they know what's happened, they're employing a lawyer and going.
And you're like, what happened to the love? Yeah,
to try and kind of like separate the love,
right?
Undo the love.
And part of what you're saying here is that Beulah can almost, unknowingly sort of denature or adulterate the things that it seeks to celebrate or support.
And I think again, it's because Beulah itself needs to be in the service of something more,
right? Which we'll come to.
So love is not an end in itself. Love is a desire for more, the desire to reach out, to grow, and so on. I mean, this has been long observed. Plato said that love is not a god, love is a demon. It's a kind of go-between. It's expansive of reality for sure, but it needs something to expand towards. Otherwise, it's inclined to turn in on itself. So it's a culture can become like that. All you need is love is an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
If
the Beatles were wrong. The Beatles were wrong. Yeah. No, I remember my first ever event I chaired at the RSA. I don't know, maybe even 10 years ago now. I'm not sure. Was with Adam Kahaney, and he'd written a book called Power and Love. And at some point that line came up. All you need is love, and the Beatles being wrong. And I'll never forget that was just a moment where you sort of realize that this over-relying on love is, somehow immature or it's not seeing the full picture.
I mean, the only thing is that these things are always in relationships. So maybe if it was sung at a moment when there was a very, generational consciousness around, and they were saying that we've got to love each other, not just kind of have transactional relationships or something,
And likewise, there could be a song, All You Need Is Power, in a different context, so it is very much about where, what's it in the service of again. But I suppose just a few more points on Beulah, because I'm trying to link it to some of the other concepts that are around. You mentioned already the culture wars and how it can often feel that we're really trapped. I mean, I heard a colleague recently saying that when they look at the US at the moment, and the really quite a fierce culture war that's becoming an information war, and maybe even a sort of potentially a civil war with real weapons. And one of the things they said that really struck me was they don't see any scope for de-escalation. It was as if, and thinking of it in terms of Beulah as I understand it, it's as if in their own moral universes, with their own concepts and their own ethics, they can't find a way to speak a lingua franca that would allow them to somehow transcend their differences and be one United States again. I mean, time will tell, and let's hope it doesn't come to that at all, but already there are some signs of that. And which brings me to sort of, I suppose I just want to not to go too quickly to eternity, because I'm nervous about the idea that somehow, you know, we've already managed to say all you need is not love. You know, you need more than love. But there's something about eternity as your touchstone that, while one can understand it, I want to be sure that it really becomes clear that there's a need for that. You know, and why do I ask that, Mark? Because in the context we're in, as you know, and some of the community that Perspectiva is part of, there's a lot of, you know, thinking at a civilization-wide level. People, there's a community called the Game B community, where they're often trying to do what they call ontological design, which is like thinking through the whole world, including ethics and morality, including educational systems at scale, including different ways of doing governance. You know, there's also meta-modernism and a particular political version of that, where they're trying to design patterns of governance that can be scaled around the world. And when I hear all these things, part of me is like intrigued and interested, but my heart tells me this is not really where the solution lies. And your essay and Blake, and more generally, perhaps even Gebser and perhaps Aurobindo and perhaps Barfield, they're all pointing to something else. So I just wanted to sort of lay that out, that before we speak about what Blake means by eternity, there is a broader pattern here. It's not just one guy's idea and a term which is quite loaded because it means so many things. But the vision of imagination that Blake offers, that lands up in this idea of eternity, is symptomatic or indicative of a broader pattern of insight, which says something like, hope for humankind rests somehow in the imagination and somehow beyond us, and we have to make ourselves receptive to that. Is that roughly how you see it? That's how I see it, roughly.
Yeah, I know. I think that's very, very nicely put, with the range, but also the hope. I mean, one way of putting what is going wrong in the US is that the American dream feels like it's not quite so substantial as it used to be. And that is a kind of ideal or a hope for a better future that transcends the present. Now, it may be conceived of in rather material ways, like, you know, earning more than your parents and so on, but nonetheless, there's that kind of sense that the future can transcend the present. And for all the horrors around Donald Trump, I think that's one thing he really does understand, is that if you can align yourself with what's very powerful in America, the American dream, people are going to be drawn towards you. Whereas perhaps one of the mistakes the liberal left makes is it's too inclined to see things as needing a technical fix. And so you lose touch with that ideal and the senses of, you know, this isn't really going anywhere. And then once you tried a few generations of technical fixes and it doesn't really solve the problem, it starts to actually even spiral down, and you start to even feel like a bit generational or Ulro even.
Right.
I mean, in the UK, it's one of the reasons why I'm a monarchist, actually, because I think that monarchy at its best, of course it's never perfect, but at its best, it's a symbol that stands, say, for an ideal of justice, you know, Her Majesty's justice, that is never actually realised in the law courts, as, you know, anyone who's involved in the law knows. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, it holds open the possibility that mm-hmm. that's what we're aiming for.
Right.
And if you close down those ideals, you know, which again are something that transcends most of reality that we know, then you actually lose something really important. I know, you know, the philosophers talk about heuristic functions and things like this. Blake was very, very clear that human beings want more. In fact, he went even any further and said, human beings want it all.
Right.
That is part of what it is to be a human being. And unless you take that seriously, you're always going to come unstuck in the solutions you propose.
So we'll come to eternity in a moment, but just what you just said reminded me of something else, which is that I recently re-listened to the famous exchange in the Dostoevsky's book, I believe it was his last book, The Brothers Karamazov, and particularly the scene that's most famous, the Grand Inquisitor scene, where in effect it's a monologue where at the height of the Spanish Inquisition, Jesus appears on earth, at least they think it's Jesus, and the Grand Inquisitor, you know, he gets captured, and he basically says, "Why did you come back?" You know, and it's a long conversation in which the Inquisitor speaks a lot about human beings. And when you said they're and what they're like, and he said that he describes them as rebels at heart. And just when you said they want everything, you know, that we're in our nature to always yearn for more and to yearn for the totality somehow, I thought of that scene, because he's saying because they yearn for that, you have to find a way of giving them that. And he was suggesting that you do it through authority and mystery and miracle. And he was castigating Jesus for not doing that, for saying that instead Jesus had asked them to give their love voluntarily, to find their freedom through their outpouring of love. But he said that was a hopeless case. And it's a very ambiguous and brilliant scene, because one's not sure at the end of it whether it sounds like, you know, the Christian doctrine has been left bloodied on the ropes. You know, it's just not clear. But I mention it now because there is this fundamental premise about what human beings are like, and this yearning, and that manifests politically somehow, right? There's something about the strong men of the moment, whether it's sort of Xi in China or Putin or Bolsonaro or, you know, even Johnson in the UK or Trump in the US. You know, people look at them and go, how could anyone vote for this guy? You know, and the answer is not because they've got some great spiritual quality, but there is something about their speaking of the whole at some, I don't know, mythological or subliminal or unconscious level that is somehow more than just a sort of retail politics. If you vote for this, I'll get that, or, you know, issue by issue basis. They're trying to present some kind of mythos. And the mythos is a real active ingredient. You know, politically it matters. People see it, they feel it. But what I'm trying to ask you really is, why do they see it and feel it? Like, what is it that we're not seeing? Because you mentioned in the paper something about these forms of, you know, archaic consciousness and mythic consciousness and aspects of our psyche that we tend to disavow. But I think you're arguing, look, these are real things, and we reject them at our peril, and that what we need is to understand them in a more beneficent, positive way, and move into them, and that with that understanding, rather than just pretending they're not there when they retreat into shadow and we're all screwed. Sorry, that's roughly how I see it. So
yeah. I mean, you know, it's very complicated. But to pick up on the scene with the Grand Inquisitor and the Jesus character, I mean, this is where for eternity, you do have to be prepared to countenance some sort of spiritual dimension,
right?
Some kind of vertical takeoff, if you like, that is immanent and implicit and shines through the material world, but is more than the material world as well. Right. It's transcendence, not just meant as in improving my lot on my forebears, but transcendence as it is normally taken to mean, you know, seeing the hallelujah sunrise, not just the Guinea sun.
Right.
And the thing about the Grand Inquisitor is that he's in actually quite a Beulah state. Right. You know, he does care about others, but he wants this Jesus figure to sign up to giving people what they think they want. So he says, you know, look, turn the stones into bread. If you can feed them, they'll be fine.
Yeah. And
it makes, you know, the Christians sit up, because of course they know that's what the devil tempted Jesus to do in the wilderness, turn the stones into bread. Yeah. And the incredibly powerful moment in that exchange is when Jesus doesn't actually engage with the Grand Inquisitor, as he says, a monologue, but then kisses the Grand Inquisitor. And the genius of that moment is that it's introducing something completely new. that the Grand Inquisitor just does not know what to do with at all. And it's, again, it's this sense that there might be something new is born out of a moment of crisis and struggle and wrestling. You know, crises in the origin of the word, these turning points. And so I think there's no move to higher consciousnesses that without some sort of struggle. I mean, you know, that's actually true in the developmental story as well. You know, we grow up from being infants and so on. That's not actually that unusual a thought. But what is really key for Blake is that there is this fourfold imagination where everything actually looks very dramatically different, even from in the state of Beulah. Time, space, freedom, death, the whole shebang takes on 4 dimensions or more. And that's what I think leaders, you know, they play with, and they will sidle up, you know, like Putin sidles up with Russian Orthodoxy and its nationalism. You know, in Southern America, Catholicism can be used to the same, in the same way. But when it's used manipulatively like that, it's normally a form of spiritual materialism, as I think of it, where the spiritual aspect is actually collapsed. And so basically what's promised is a utopia in this world. Blake was very clear that that's a terrible mistake. One of his characters, called Loss, spends quite a lot of his time building Golgonooza, to use another wonderful Blakean expression. And it's kind of Loss in some moments hopes to build an ideal city on Earth, but then he realizes it's not possible. But the struggle to build the city is nonetheless valuable because it creates a sense of limitation, and then begins to be perceived how you need a whole different dimension, really. And death, just to add one more thought in, I think, you know, a test of a true spiritual path, you might say, is nearly always in how it treats death. And if it just sidelines death by saying death doesn't really matter, it's just kind of a figment of our imagination, or you know, can be done away with, the dead, as it were, just in the next door room. That to me, that's a key sign that we're probably dealing with some sort of spiritual materialism here. Because the point about, a big point about moving into eternity is the realization that life flows into us from the outside. I think that's one way of putting it. And that with a real felt sense of that comes the desire even to realign the center of your existence to outside of yourself. And then and so that's, in the more traditional language, is about, you know, becoming less selfish and so on. It's not a moral injunction in eternity. I think that's really important. It's not a burden. It's not a sense of guilt. I should be doing this. I should be doing that. It becomes a desire because you start to see that the center of life is everywhere. And so you realize that infinite life actually lies outside of yourself, even as that outside is welcoming you towards it. To enjoy it fully, to become a co-creator with it. And imagination then takes on this fourfold quality. So yeah, I don't know if that makes some sense. But
no, it does. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I find that it's somewhat, I mean, I've had moments of experience somewhat like that, but I find it's beyond my daily experience. But nonetheless, I recognize the description of it in what I know of, as I've mentioned, you know, Gebser, Barfield, Aurobindo, and all of these other people who speak of something like getting beyond a perspectival mentality, getting beyond a purely mental view of the world, ceasing to see the world as something that one has a transaction with instrumentally to get things from and to meet needs, and somehow to be more fully, you know, a sort of something more like non-dual consciousness, where the boundary between subject and object breaks down, or you know,
just to add on the non-dual, if I can say, I mean, I think that the reason why that is an increasingly attractive and very powerful perception is that what it tries to do is get the balance between me and not me right. So this eternity for Blake is not the dissolution of the ego. It's not nirvana in the strict literal sense of, you know, it's snuffing yourself out. It's actually realizing that yourself is in the service of this more. And so there's my consciousness of this non-dual state, if you like. And that's what the word non-dual tries to capture.
Interesting. So you're not necessarily lost within it. You're not submerged or you don't disappear you're still distinct
Yeah.
and very much of value and unique, but
So it's, yeah.
nonetheless part of something. So it's a very much a both and quality. It's
Yeah. It's unity as a form of harmonious diversity
right,
rather than as
right.
uniformity.
Got it, got it.
And you
Yeah,
know, many of the great spiritual visions present this. You know, when I'm very keen on Dante and the Divine Comedy, and one of the real struggles for Dante in Paradise is that as he, as it were, rises higher in the heavens, which is to say, as he sees reality more and more deeply, more and more truthfully,
right.
he realizes that the souls there become more and more themselves. And at first he doesn't get it, because how can they be in this kind of harmonious state? And then he realizes that it's precisely because they are, as it were, like the perfect jewel that reflects the sunlight.
Yes.
And then another jewel reflects the sunlight.
Yeah.
But the jewel has to be perfectly cut. It has to be fully itself in order to reflect the sunlight, so that you get that wonderful dazzle effect.
Right.
So I mean, another way of putting it is that it's quite, if you know, when you see the Dalai Lama, or you see a Desmond Tutu, or someone that you feel has a full humanity, they're also very, very particular people.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
they're instantly, their particularity is felt as well as what they seem to be channeling. So it's that kind of dynamic that Blake's getting at in Eternity as well.
Wow, I mean, there's too much to say almost, but I mean, I'm reminded of a Kabir line about everyone knows that there are drops in every ocean, but not everyone knows there's an ocean in every drop. And something like becoming aware of oneself as both drop and ocean. And there's something else there. I'm reminded of it's used in sort of some Buddhist circles to avoid spiritual bypassing. That you have to be somebody before you can be nobody. But it's also understood now, I think, as you were indicating there, that the real nobodies, so to speak, are actually very distinct, particular, highly individuated beings who have their own unique kind of quality. It's not as though they disappear and blend in with everything. It's like, you know. So anyway, there's a lot more to say, but I want to just grasp eternity before we round off.
Yeah.
Grasp
Tell you
eternity.
what, can I just ask you to hold on to that, your last thing, and just add one more piece, because I think it's often talked about and it is really crucial, which is sometimes called the shadow work.
Right.
Blake called it self-annihilation.
Right.
And what he didn't mean was blasting yourself
with a shotgun.
to disappear. He meant, as it were, burning off all that makes you want to hold on to life, to possess things, to be in control. That is the crucial dynamic. And actually, when I was writing the essay, I also happened at the same time to be rereading Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, partly because I was looking for resources to think about the culture wars today. And I think I felt that part of the genius of that essay is that she actually moves through all of Blake's states.
Right.
Now, she doesn't explicitly do that, of course, and I don't want to use her essay to that, but it really helped me because, on the one hand, she is arguing for a room of one's own. She wants that right, as it were. But then she moves on to what she calls the androgynous mind, where she looks out of her window and sees a man and woman meeting on the street and realizes that for all her need to protest for her rights as a woman, her mind also relaxes when she sees the man and the woman meet. And that's a really powerful moment for her, because she realizes that there's a different consciousness there in the meeting as well as in the need to fight. And then that takes her to wonder about Shakespeare's mind and how Shakespeare seemed to be able to just transmit all characters. So you have almost no sense of who Shakespeare was as a person, and yet he so vividly portrays all sorts of characters that you can imagine living. And she argues that what Shakespeare had done is what Blake would call self-annihilation. And Virginia Woolf has this wonderful expression where she talks about how Shakespeare had burnt off all desire to protest, to have the world stand as a witness against his strife. And that's hard work. That is not easy to do. It is a kind of death of the self.
Yeah.
And I mean, it mustn't be done speedily either, because it can become very damaging to feel you ought to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, there's something in this process that once you kind of get over yourself, you're actually able to see there's so much more in life, and even bring more of that life into, the world around you.
Right.
So that whole complex is absolutely fundamental to the transition to eternity as well.
Okay, talking of that, so I shared your essay with some Perspectiva colleagues, and going to round off with 3 questions. The first is about Blake's idea of true friendship being opposition. The second is about what it means to sort of not to see with your eyes, but somehow through them, that, you know, what the source of vision may be. And I think that connects to eternity. I mean, both of these things do in some ways. And the third was from, so the oppositional friendship question was from Tom Chatfield. The seeing not with the eyes, but through them was from Anthea Lawson. And Pippa Evans wanted to know a bit more about, you know, this idea that imagination is something that we can somehow expand and work with, you know, the more applied element of what do we do with this understanding if we want to move towards eternity as a sort of form of perception. And I guess not too quickly, and I guess it's not all about achieving the highest state, of course, but just something about that. So first things first, in eternity, you have a lovely line somewhere that is something like, Blake realized that he didn't see with his eyes, but through them. And that's, I think, quite close to what you're saying about a spiritual feature of life being quite important for eternity as a form of imagination.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to kind of where we started, that even the seemingly unimaginative gathering of data by the Ulro existing scientists, not wanting to be nasty to scientists. I mean, I did a physics degree, and I know that they're full of imaginative speculations and pleasures, as well as needing that to try and conceive what the cosmos is about. But just for the sake of the argument, even a data capturing, we'll say computer, embedded in the way that's been designed, is a take on the world. Mm-hmm. You know, so for example, it's an atomistic take on the world. And again, you know, as many philosophers of science have pointed out, the metaphysics comes before the physics, and then it determines what you go looking for and then what you find. Mm-hmm. So that's the way that imagination might play out in that way. So, you know, it means that we see sort of with our eyes are in the service of that prior sense of things, rather than, as it were, our eyes just receiving reality straight. That never happens.
So that much is given. I mean, we construct, you know, our sense of reality through our minds, not just from sense data from our eyes. But I think there was something greater implied, that somehow, you know, there's this conversation about witness states where, you know, there's the thoughts, and then there's the thinker, and then there's the one who notices the thinker. And something like that is going on, I think, in that statement with Blake's perception, that you become aware of being a faculty of perception or a faculty of imagination in a way that is coming through you and not being generated by you, that you're somehow picking this up from outside of you, rather than it just being the brain somehow constructing it. So it's as if it has its own lived reality outside of one's psyche. That's how I understood it anyway. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I mean, just another slightly different way of putting it would be, it's what the fundamentalist doesn't get. The fundamentalist does not get that there's not just the knower and what's known, but there's the knowing as well.
Right.
And when you have that third quality of the knowing, you can start to play with that. And see that it's possible for the knower and the known to change if you change the knowing. Okay,
well, that comes to Pippa's question in some ways. So in terms of working with imagination in practice, what kinds of things do you think what does it mean to play with the knowing in practice?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can return the favour to Pippa, because it was doing one of Pippa's workshops, in one of her Improv Your Life workshops, that I had a very powerful felt sense of this, because what improv forces you to do is to rely on what's given to you. And
improvisation, you mean here, yeah.
Yeah, well, one of Pippa's first kind of lessons or rules of improv is you must say yes to what's given. Now you can then later play with what it means to actually say no, but you've got to develop that first capacity to receive what's given. And that is about trusting that an imagination can be shared between you and someone else. It produces this sense of suddenly the activity is happening between two people. And then Pippa, over the course of a weekend, will try and take you through exercises that develop that. And in particular, a third element that might be introduced is a kind of frame for what is coming between the two people. So one of the fun exercises that you might do is imagine you're on a shopping channel, and there's you co-presenters describing an object, but there's this third space which is trying to sell it to viewers that you imagine is there. And so that adds another dimension. It gives a sort of purpose to your immediate imaginative activity. And then I think the fullest expression, which Pippa and her colleagues at the Showstoppers are so brilliant at, is that you actually end up telling a story that's full of meaning and gives you highs and lows. And I mean, that is to have a very full kind of imagination that's got lots of skill, it's got lots of learning, it's got musical knowledge, it's got how stories work kind of at your fingertips, but also strangely forgotten, so that the story itself can have that quality of flow. And the genius moments in those improvised shows are when you think, my goodness, where on earth did that come from? And it's a really good question, because it has sort of come from somewhere else, as all the participants have got lost, again, this sort of self-annihilation, lost but fully themselves in the generative process itself.
Yeah. No, that's good example. And then finally, you mentioned this notion of famous line of Blake's that isn't maybe considered enough, that opposition is true friendship. What does he mean, and why does it matter?
Well, maybe we can answer it like this, that it was picked up between the friendship of another person I'm a great fan of, Owen Barfield, who was a great inspiring figure for C.S. Lewis, a very well-known author. And one of C.S. Lewis's books actually was dedicated to Barfield, and he used the Blake quote, "Opposition is true friendship," for the dedication. And what Lewis described it as was that he thought you have a kind of what he called a first friend, who in a way is the friend in a Beulah state, that makes you feel safe and comfortable, pleasurable, enjoying the world. But there's not much tension between you and your first friend. You just kind of get on with life. But you also need a second friend, as he put it, who you completely trust, who you know has got something for you, but often it's combative. There's disagreement, there's tension, there may be even fallings out. And Lewis and Barfield had a whole year-long confrontation about actually the relationship between reason and the imagination that they called their Great War. And Lewis realized that he needed Barfield as an opposition friend in order that he could move on from being a rather rational philosopher, as he was in his early youth, to becoming one of the co-founders of fantasy literature in the 20th century. So it's that kind of tension, but that's based on a sense of trust and commitment nonetheless, but generates a third thing again. It's this sort of sense of a third emerging. I think Plato realized this. One of the reasons I think Plato wrote dialogues and not just treatises is because he often has his characters in some sort of conflict or tension. And he knows that in the dialogue, something different emerges. So that would be another example of oppositional friendship.
And even in debate, I suppose, if debates are done properly, if you really are trying to get to the truth. But so often, of course, that's not what happens.
Yeah, I mean, in the essay, I was very much thinking what we've talked about this before, how a debate that leads to more is one that criticizes, but so as to reveal more, or judges, but not to subjugate, but to illuminate. So these critical faculties can be used in this expansive direction, when the aim is not to, as it were, win the war, but is to together move into a different land almost.
Great. So the very last question, then, Mark, because we've covered a lot, we've kicked the ball around a lot, as they say. I'm just trying to sort of get my bearings on what this all means, because over the last sort of 4 years or so of forming Perspectiva and being exposed to lots of different epistemic communities and spiritual communities, and people doing new economic thinking, and others doing mindfulness, and others arguing for some kind of radical rethinking of civilization as a whole to avoid existential or catastrophic risk, or others who want to sort of completely fundamentally change the purpose of society to make it a more educational society and less an economic one. And in amongst all of that, beaming in from outside almost, you have these different kinds of perspective. And you mentioned Virginia Woolf as a female example, but the others are all, at least as far as I know, male. And they include, Jean Gebser and Sri Aurobindo and Owen Barfield, and what they're sort of saying, and Blake now as well. And what they all seem to be saying, and I think, to be honest, Ian McGilchrist probably says something similar in his more recent work, is that, the answer is in some sense spiritual. And that's something I began trying to say at the RSA some 8 years ago, but I didn't really know what I was saying in these terms, but still intuited that you reach these limits otherwise, that if all you have is epistemology and morality and ethics and game theory and whatever other tools you're bringing, you're going to stay in this kind of Beulah state where you can't adequately deal with shadow and you cannot be sufficiently receptive to genuinely new forms of consciousness where that means something and it isn't just a buzzword. So in light of all of that, Mark, how does one go about making it happen, as it were? Or is that even the right question? How does one allow it to happen, or facilitate it, or husband it, or what is the right way of understanding what this means for our activity in the world?
It's a big question, but I think a key component, at least, is a kind of active receptivity. So rather than just thinking of our activity being about our agency and power in that way, it's as relationship matters, and it's combined with the imagination to start to not just trust, but maybe it involves trust at first, but to start to really feel that our life is embedded and situated not just in the lives of other human beings, but a vitality of the natural world, of the cosmos. And I'm actually quite happy with theistic language. It makes a lot of sense to me for this reason, that it has that spiritual quality too, both divine intelligences, which traditionally might be called angels, but this kind of soul that can be felt to exist in places and as well as in people, this kind of living vitality, and then ultimately the divine as well.
Right.
But I think that there's not much point in having too many arguments about it. Reason needs to be in the service of discernment rather than trying to control itself. But to in being engaged in the sense that ecology, to use another really important word now, it's not just about how we can manage the material ecology around and about us, but to realize that there's a kind of spiritual ecology as well, that can be felt in and through the material and the natural world. And again, I think, it can sound a bit outre, but actually it's never far away from, say, scientific breakthroughs. You mentioned Einstein, the imagination. The word ecology comes from the Romantic tradition as well, and von Humboldt's traveling to different parts of the world and realizing that even if they're on opposite sides of the globe, there can be a felt sense of similarity. And so he developed the idea that there was a kind of ecology that can speak of the whole as well as just the parts. So you've got to be open to that felt sense. You've got to trust the imagination. You've got to work at it. But ultimately, I think the difference is realizing that life is outside of us as well as within us. And that, that can be a very big ask in the modern world. Right. But that I think that's, for me, this difficult word spiritual, which you've wrestled so much with, that is one way of trying to really nail it, that the spiritual dimension knows when it's fully developed, but at least trusts that there is a vitality in a life that's autonomous and has its own way of doing things in the world and in the cosmos and in other realms as well, that we are invited to relate to. And I think perhaps one of the key things that makes us humans is that we're invited to relate to it in a self-aware way as well. I'm sure that lots of other animals and creatures and even vegetation and plants relate to it in their own way. But we seem to have this extra piece certainly seems more distinctive in us, which is that we can become more self-consciously aware of these different dynamics. And so you get all these figures, both the developmental people, but also these other figures that go for the evolution of consciousness, of which I think Blake is one.
Yes. And I was reminded there when you were speaking, Owen Barfield has this lovely expression, the inside of the whole world, which is, you know, just very evocative, like that consciousness is best understood as the inside of the whole world. But when you were speaking there about reaching towards the spiritual, you've also got people like Jeffrey Kripal, who is trying to highlight in his most recent book, The Flip, which he pointed me to, that actually there's something ideological preventing lots of people realizing that forms of experience that we would often call spiritual, uncanny coincidences and flashes of luminous insight and a sense of presence and all of these other things that we can't quite explain, they're often poo-pooed away and they can't survive in the lab, and parapsychologists don't get quite sufficient data to really clinch it as being a valid subject of inquiry or something. But Kripal makes the point that these are so pervasive that there's something a bit crazy about the fact that we haven't accommodated them within our worldview adequately. And that one of the things that gives me a sense of hope is that rather than wait for this vast transformation of consciousness that we sometimes talk about, as if 8 billion or so people could suddenly be radically different, I take heart from the idea that there could quite quickly be a change of intellectual fashion, such that the idea that consciousness is fundamentally non-material and not reducible to matter, and that might be indicative of some kind of ontology of subjectivity in the world that is more than just our own psyche, that there might be something real and interesting in the world that we're meant to relate to that may not necessarily be, and Kripal's very clear on this, conventional theism, or it may be nothing like it. But if we're open to that and receptive to that, it can radically change our sense of what it is to be human and what it is to live well and what it is to attempt to survive and thrive in a world that's teetering, sometimes on the brink of collapse. So,
yeah, no, I mean, I think I like Kripal's sense of it as well, that these things are happening all over the place. It's just that they've been rather disqualified, and people great and small, by which I mean great cultural figures as well as people that are just getting on with their everyday lives, and this is partly what he does in his book The Flip, have these experiences. And what he wants to foster, and because he works in the humanities, he thinks the humanities in particular can help foster is ways of talking about this again, which our forebears used to have, but because we've kind of come through this cycle which has been a bit more Ulro-like or generation-like, we've rather lost touch with, but can recover. It's not about some sort of magical thinking, hoping there's going to be some sudden massive step up, leap change. It's actually about paying attention to that which is almost most immediate to us, but we've somehow learned to discount. And there are ways of doing this. I mean, actually, I'm involved in organising a day at the moment, which we're going to do with Perspectiva as well, on what in the medieval world were known as the four senses, which essentially is how you move from a literal sense of things to an allegorical or moral sense to a topological sense, which is where things get a bit shaky and start to break down, but then to an anagogic, which broadly means looking, as it were, from the top down as well as from the bottom up. And there was whole lessons in symbolism and reading literature and so on. And people do it still in Shakespeare, because Shakespeare has that, he's still written from that point of view of the imagination. So it can become quite practical, actually. Once you learn, and psychotherapy, I think, too, is another way of doing this more in the 20th century, that starts to take things like dreams seriously. And lo and behold, you find they do take you somewhere. It's not magic. It requires you to bring a lot of yourself to the task, but nonetheless, it has this sense of the imagination that grows, that it's expansive, that's co-creative.
Yes. And so if I can draw to a close now with some of the lines from your essay. You've got this lovely ending just before you get there. You say, I'm just going to read it out. But Blake's descriptions, the energy of his verse, and his imagination can help us expand our sight in the light of the signs we receive. Just as he made much of having seen angels on Peckham Rye, the cosmos is alive and pluriform. Seeking out its parallel universes can become part of life. Fostering that hope somehow feels crucial right now. It's possible to pay attention to the states of mind in which we live and move more fluidly between them. Blake offers a training and roadmaps. It's work as in any genuine shift of consciousness. Sorry, it is work as in any genuine shift of consciousness. But human beings can cooperate with the imagination and awaken as new acuity arises. And you want to say the last two lines, Mark?
So I think it's eternity is in love with the productions of time, which is a Blake phrase, because eternity knows it's our destiny.
That's it. Beautiful. Well remembered. Right. So thanks a lot, Mark. That was a great pleasure.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate you picking it up.
Got it. Take care. Bye.
Bye.